Welcome, everybody. Welcome. This is the right place for the Emily Suzanne Clark lecture. We're going to get started by around 7:35 Central Time. Welcome, folks. I see everyone logging in. This is the correct place for the Emily Suzanne Clark lecture. I'm going to give it a few more minutes until around 7:35 Central Time, and then we'll get started. Welcome, folks. This is the right place for the Emily Suzanne Clark lecture. I'm going to give it another couple of minutes as people log on, but we'll get started no later than 7:35. Welcome, folks. You're in the right place for the Emily Suzanne Clark lecture. We still have a few people trickling on. But we'll get started no later than 7:35. All right, it looks like sign-ons have slowed down. So I think I will get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Amy Catherine Medvick. I am the Director of Educational Programming here at Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. For those who are new, Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses, managed by the Women's Exchange, preserves two 19th century New Orleans homes and, through their architecture, collections, and history, inspires discourse about our collective past and its relevance to our present and future. We invite you to come visit us the next time you are in the French Quarter. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Emily Suzanne Clark is a professor of religious studies at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, where she is also affiliate faculty with the Department of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. Her research and teaching focus on religious material culture, alternative spiritualities, African American religions, American Catholic history, haunting, and colonialism. She is the author of the multi-award-winning book, A Luminous Brotherhood, Afro-Creole Spiritualism in 19th Century New Orleans. She is also co-editor of two volumes, one on new religious movements and the other on digital religion. She is currently finishing a book on spiritualism and material culture, from the Rochester wrappings to the Ouija board, which will be published by the University of North Carolina Press. In tonight's lecture, Dr. Clark will explore 19th century spiritualist organizations in New Orleans. Talking with the spirits of the dead is a practice with a long history in the United States. In the 1800s, it became a full-fledged religion, American spiritualism, grounded in seances and communing with the dead in a fantastic variety of means. This religion swept through the nation like wildfire until the 1920s. In this lecture, Dr. Emily Clark will introduce you to a small group of politically active men in post-Civil War New Orleans who sought guidance from the spirits of the dead on how to remake the nation into one where liberty, equality, and fraternity might rule. This virtual lecture is made possible with support from the New Orleans Recreation and Culture Fund. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the lecture, and so please hold your questions until then. You can actually put them right in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then I will field them and pass them on to Dr. Clark. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Emily Clark.
Good evening. I'm now going to do the obligatory Zoom saying of, hang on, let me share my screen. Something none of us have said before. All right, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to do this and talk with you all about spiritualism in New Orleans, the spirits of New Orleans, what the dead have to say, and why it matters. So this evening, I'm going to introduce you to a little understood religious movement in the US that began in the mid-19th century, spiritualism. We'll spend some time understanding the context in which this religious movement developed, as well as its beliefs and practices. Then I'll talk about why it attracted people to it, especially a group of Afro-Creole men in 19th century New Orleans. But first, I'm going to ask you to use your imagination a bit. The year is 1857. You're headed to a friend's house close to the Mississippi River. They're having you and your spouse and a few other friends over for an evening of religious experimentation. A mutual friend recently tried her hand at spiritualism, and she discovered she's a medium for spirits of the dead. So you're getting together to see if you all, as a group, can channel the spirits of the dead. This possibility is of particular interest to you because you lost a loved one in the yellow fever outbreak of 1853 that swept through the city. Because of the lack of modern scientific knowledge about medicine, many people have lost a loved one recently. And little do you know that just in a few years, a civil war will lead to the death of hundreds of thousands of American citizens. It seems everybody knows about death, but the mystery of the other side still remains. After you arrive at your friend's home and the pleasantries are over, you all sit around a large parlor table with the medium. She asks people to sit in alternating patterns, man then woman, hot temperament then cold temperament, receptive to forces around you to somewhat standoffish. She explains that this will help you create a spiritual battery, which will assist the spirit's ability to communicate through her. You hold hands, you sing a Christian hymn to establish further harmony around the table, and then the medium asks if there are any presences in the room. You almost hold your breath in anticipation and excitement. You're not sure what to believe, and you have no idea what is about to happen. So, in a nutshell, spiritualism is a religious movement that developed in mid 19th century America, and it remained popular through the early 20th century. Spiritualism, as a movement, aimed at proving the immortality of the soul by establishing communication with the spirits of the dead. The most common practice was the seance, which began as a private affair, but public demonstrations became increasingly popular as time went on. Mediumship also changed over time, from first enabling spirits to simply rap on tables and interpret that means, to receiving messages, to full materializations of spirits. So the origins of American spiritualism were both easy and difficult to explain. Many people point to three young women in upstate New York, but they alone can't explain the development of the movement. A brief look at the larger context of religion and culture in 19th century America helps us a bit. So, spiritualism was hardly the new form of religious innovation happening during the 19th century. The 19th century US was full of new, unorthodox versions of Christianity, just popping up all over the United States. Um, just a brief list of some examples include the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Seventh-day Adventism, the Shakers, various perfectionist communities, and spiritualism. There were also other bigger cultural factors at play. Occultism has become something of a dirty word, especially in the wake of the satanic panics of the 1980s and 90s. Often, when we hear the word occult, we think of devil worship. But really, the term itself refers to those practices and beliefs that sort of exist somewhere between formal religion and science. Things like mysticism, folk medicine, magic, a lot of new age beliefs and practices that were so popular in the 70s and continue to be popular today. All of these would fall under this category. So, in the whole, there was widespread acceptance of the supernatural in the young United States. There were also new ideas about science. We think technology these days moves at lightning speed, but the scientific revolutions of the 19th century are hard for us to fully appreciate. Things changed incredibly quickly at that time, and the speed of those discoveries were new. Just think about it, the steam locomotive, the telegraph, and later the telephone, photography, gas lighting, and then electricity. Technology just wowed people constantly. Reform movements were also in the air. Things like women's rights, the abolitionist movement. It wasn't just scientific discoveries that brought feelings of change across the nation. This was social and cultural too. The world felt changeable. You should expect the unexpected. And this was the case with authority too, in general. Everyone who we assume to have and deserve power and leadership positions, we were starting to question that. So, all of this sets the ground for spiritualism coming together. So, we're going to zoom in a little bit more, then we'll move into the context of New Orleans. But having all of this bigger background can be really, really helpful. So I'm going to briefly run through the origins of spiritualism, some key practices, then we're going to get into, the main event of New Orleans. So a couple of forces that bring spiritualism together include the work of a Swedish scientist and theologian by the name of Emanuel Swedenborg. He wrote a book called Heaven and Its Wonders and Hell. And what this book did was it recounted his spirit's visits to the heavens and hells beyond this world. It becomes really influential for many strains of Christianity. But for us, what's really important is that he has this view of a layered spiritual world beyond this one, in which spirits of the dead reside. He's followed by a fellow from Germany by the name of Franz Antoine Mesmer, whose 1766 doctoral dissertation, so writing not that long after Swedenborg, his dissertation on the influence of the planets, examined the power of planetary magnetic fields and what he called animal magnetism, which I'm sure you're thinking about all of the celebrities these days who we think of as having animal magnetism. But what he meant was these invisible forces that permeated all living beings. And magnetic, and that, you could be attracted or repelled by some of these forces, but we were all connected by invisible forces that we couldn't see. And these invisible forces could be manipulated in order to improve someone's health or harmony through the practice of trance. So, what's important here is the idea that there are invisible forces around us that we can interact with. An American who really popularized this was a fellow by the name of Andrew Jackson Davis, who wrote extensively. I mean, we're talking big fat books, one after the other, that talked about the spiritual spheres beyond our living world, um, and how you interact with them, what they're like. He would go into these public trances and describe what it was that he saw. His teachings on harmony and balance with the spirits, though actually probably would not have been that popular if it wasn't for three women, the famous Fox sisters, Maggie, Kate, and Leah. Maggie and Kate were only young girls when all of this began. It gets known as the Rochester Rappings of 1848. Their family was renting a small farmhouse outside of Rochester, New York. And during the late 1840s, the family began to hear knocks and raps on the floors, tables, the walls. And the family came to the conclusion that the commotion was the result of spirits, whom Maggie and Kate, who weren't even teenagers at this point, were able to communicate with. It began pretty simple, telling the spirits to knock so many times for yes, so many times for no. But then it takes off. The family kind of freaks out because, what would you do if you thought your 9-year-old was communicating with the spirits of the dead? They sent them into town to, be with bigger society. But everyone has heard about this. Family friends in Rochester spread word about the girl's abilities. And those friends told their friends, who told their friends, who told their friends, who told their friends. And the next thing you know, this entire thing is taken off. So, what are some key beliefs and practices? So, one of the really interesting things about spiritualism is there's a total lack of uniformity. There is a national organization of churches, the National Spiritualist Association of Churches, which formed in 1893. But basically, the rules to be a part of it is that you believe in communication with the dead and you believe strongly in the golden rule, which is a pretty wide net. On a more deeper level, spiritualists believe that as we progress in this life, one of our main goals is to just become further enlightened, further aware of the world around us, try to live by things like the golden rule. And after we die, our spirits do the same things. They believe we continue to learn and progress. And if we go back to those thinkers like Emanuel Swedenborg and Andrew Jackson Davis, our spirits move up the ranks in these spiritual spheres beyond our world as our spirits continue to learn and become more in harmony with other people. So a big part of their practice focuses on the belief that communication and interaction across the veil of the living and the dead is totally plausible and something that we should pursue. Because who knows better than spirits who have been working for hundreds of years to become better? Hey, they've got ideas on how we could be better people here on Earth. For many, especially in the 19th century, they saw this as completely compatible with Christianity because it wasn't actually a church, so it wasn't a rival. Many spiritualists saw their practices as working alongside Christianity. They would write about how God, Jesus, angels, other major figures from Christian history resided in those high spiritual spheres that we all try to progress to after death. Mediumship took a variety of forms. Oh man, I could go down so many rabbit holes with you, and we would be here until midnight, about how mediumship worked. There were people who were known as mental mediums who had the powers of clairvoyance and spiritual healing. This is most relevant for our group in New Orleans, who received messages from the spirits of the dead that they wrote down. But there were also these really dramatic shows of physical mediumship that included things like levitation, spiritualist painting, photography, and other things. Here's just a few images depicting this. For example, the images on the far right-hand side are examples of spirit photography, the belief that if you sat for a photograph, if one of these ghostly figures appeared behind you, that was a spirit who was there looking over you, looking after you. And then, I mean, who hasn't heard of the powerful planchette and Ouija board? These would all come later. So suffice to say, spiritualism is a pretty big movement. Not so much today, but during the 19th century, it was everywhere. And it makes sense if we think about the appeal that it might have for people who doesn't have questions about death and what happens after we die. This is one of the most human things to wonder about the nature of reality. Spiritualism provided one of the most concrete attempts at an answer by offering a way of interacting with those in that place beyond our world. And those interactions were vibrant. This also, it provided comfort. You know, mourning wasn't final. Just because your loved one died, you know that they continue on in this other space. They continue to look after you. And you know this because they tell you. You might even be able to hear, see, feel their closeness. Seances could provide comfort, closure, and confirmation that your loved one was happy and peaceful, and your souls would be reunited again. There were plenty of charlatans who were exposed during this time period, but it didn't put a huge dent in the appeal that continued on. And then beginning to zero in on what's most relevant for us tonight, the appeal of spiritualism also intersected with politics. When we think about the intersection of religion and politics, it has a lot to do with how people understand the world around them and how they wish to change it. What would be a utopia? What would be the best way for society to operate? Wouldn't it would be great if someone who knew way more than us would tell us and give us some advice? And there was something very countercultural about spiritualism. It took religious leadership and authority away from where people long assumed it belonged. You know, formal institutions with hierarchies of privileged, educated white men. And instead, spiritual authority resided in mediums, and mediums could be anyone. I mean, the Fox sisters were three young girls. Many mediums were women. And while the majority of spiritualists in the US were white, there was also this small group of spiritualists in New Orleans. It was a group of Black men who engaged in spiritualism from the late 1850s until 1877. They called themselves the Cercle Harmonique, which is simply just French for harmonic circle. So, practicing between the late 1850s and 1877, the years of their practice were unstable ones, marked by racial violence and political liminality. So their seance archive begins just a couple of years before the Battle of Fort Sumter and continues until the end of Reconstruction. This is a volatile time in the American South. Following the war, the city of New Orleans was enmeshed in both violence and progress. The first Black man to serve as governor of any state was Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, governor of Louisiana from December 9th, 19, or not 19, 1872 until January 13th, 1873. He had a very brief tenure because his boss got impeached. But the point here is the US would not see another Black governor until 1990. His tenure as governor, as well as the election of other Black politicians to local and state offices, reflected a really hopeful atmosphere. The Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution put to law that potential. Amendments that abolished slavery, amendments that extended suffrage to Black men. This was a hopeful time, but it was also a deadly place and time. White supremacist violence thwarted Black civil and political rights. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist terrorist organizations threatened and killed Black people in the South. Race riots and massacres were not uncommon throughout the region. The world surrounding the practice of the Cercle Harmonique, what's really fascinating here is it was one of challenge and possibility. It was one of hope and lament. There was so much that was happening, and so many people, so many spirits that came to them to advise them. So, who all visited the Cercle Harmonique during those 20 years? Well, here's a smattering of names. Um, we have political figures, big political giants in American history, from Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, figures like radical abolitionist John Brown, figures like the General of the Confederate Army, Robert E. Lee. We have other big political names who wrote frequently about equality of all people, from the French Revolution, Robespierre, Montesquieu, Voltaire. We've got religious figures from St. Vincent de Paul to Jesus to Confucius. We also have figures like their deceased parents and their deceased loved ones. And then anonymous spirits. There's one there that is just signed off as your friends in French. Over their 20 years of practice, they filled 35 large register books, some of which were multiple hundreds of pages. So, altogether amounting to thousands of pages of spirit messages that they would receive during seances and meticulously write down. The primary handwriting here is that of Henri Ray, an Afro-Creole man who came from a politically and socially active family. His parents were mixed race and came from Haiti after the revolution. His father was incredibly active in philanthropy, helping create, and for a period of time, he led a beloved Catholic school for disadvantaged children. Additionally, on his father-in-law's side, or on his in-law side, his father-in-law was cousins to one of the most significant Black nuns in the US, Henriette DeLille, the creators of the Sisters of the Holy Family in New Orleans, who's currently up for canonization. So, needless to say, members of this group were really connected in to the city and its political and social activism. As a fun note, in a somewhat autobiographical essay that's tucked in the back of one of their seance books, Henri wrote about how, a few months after he heard about spiritualism, he tried to levitate a table out of curiosity and succeeded. And then he got a little more curious. He attended a seance, and as he put it, he laughed at the madness of some people, and pretended to be a medium and was mocking them. And then he felt part of his body shake violently. And he identified the spirit of his deceased father-in-law coming into him to deliver a message. And I just love this origin story of his mediumship. He makes fun of spiritualism, then he gets humbled by it. And like his own father, he was super active in the local political scene. In 1868, he was elected to the House of Representatives in the state of Louisiana. Like his father, he was very active in educational outreach. He served as a chairman for the Committee on the Constitution. He served on the New Orleans District school board. He was all over this. So these were guys, the guys at the seance table for the Cirque Harmonique. They were clued in to what was going on in the world around them, this period of volatility and fear, but also, the possibilities in the wake of the Civil War. Other mediums in their group included a blacksmith by the name of J.B. Valmore, who is, if you're a history nerd, somewhat of a little bit of a celebrity in 19th century New Orleans, and the son of a wealthy landowning family, a man by the name of Francois Duplessis. So again, it's not necessarily everyday folks. Um, it's guys who are invested in creating an America in which it lives up to that promise of all men are created equal. And so it's not surprising that many of their messages focused on government and equality. The spirits provided advisement on how best to remake the US in the wake of the Civil War. Many messages focused on civil rights and human rights and offered hope in the face of white supremacist violence. So the two images of messages that are popping up there, we've got one from the spirit of Abraham Lincoln, talking about how he was a martyr, and he still proclaims liberty. Many of their messages were recorded in French, but the one below is one that was recorded in their records in English from radical abolitionist John Brown, who led the raid on Harper's Ferry, telling us, if you fall for freedom to all, you rise again free from all. In glory I am, because for human rights I gave my life. In particular, this view of the two of them as being spirits who are well off in the spiritual world because they advocated for equality for all, ties into this image drawn by the group of the ladder of progress. And I think this is such a fascinating image. At the bottom, we've got like a doodle of a little guy at a seance table. And coming up from him is this ladder of progress, where we have images of spirits being associated with various spiritualist virtues. And at the very top is a depiction of a man who looks a lot like 19th century depictions of Jesus. So here's this ladder of progress, and they mention it in some of their messages. So, for example, there's a message that they received from the spirit of Abraham Lincoln, where he says that he's at the top of the ladder of progress already, just years after his assassination. because of the Emancipation Proclamation. It kind of like gave him an automatic promotion to the top. In contrast, the spirit of Napoleon Bonaparte um, tells them that he is groaning at the foot of the ladder of progress because of his political greed. And I think there's just something a little funny about Napoleon, imagining him going, "Oh, why did I do what I did?" Um, so even in terms of where they think people reside in the world after this one, how advanced are they as a spirit? It has a lot to do with what they did politically. Did they advocate for the equality of all or not? And for the Cirque Harmonique, a lot of this had to do with racial identity. So, unlike American politics and society, which base their hierarchies in part on racial difference, especially when we think about the pre-Civil War era, some of the main legal identities for people were enslaved and free, which had a racial connotation for the most point. The spirits denied the significance of race. There is message after message that the Cirque Harmonique record in their records um, that tell them that race matters socially here, but it doesn't truly matter. All people would be luminous in the spirit world. And in spirit form before God, they all were equal beings. Race only marked one's material body, not the state of one's soul, not what was on the inside. After death, you leave your material body behind and you would enter this raceless world. For example, the father of one of the mediums, when a grandfather, I'm sorry, the grandfather of one of the mediums, delivered a spirit message where he said that though he appeared black on earth, his spirit manifested as his real being. In other words, it was what was on the inside that showed after death. Even the spirit of Confucius, which there's a whole rabbit hole we could go down as to why the spirit of Confucius pops up in their records. The spirit of Confucius said there are no different races, really, because everyone is children of the same father. The great lesson of death was recognizing equality and solidarity. Um, the message that's up there comes from a French priest during the French Revolution, Hugh Félicité de Lamennais. Um, Father Lamennais was a huge advocate for the lower classes during the French Revolution. He would have been on the side of the little guy. And here, in part of this message, he more or less says that categories like race and nationality, they're not that important because they focus on what's not important. What matters is the universal connection of humanity. When we start to categorize people via race or nationality, we're losing the point. The point is that all of us are truly equal. And so, one of the things that this points to is the Cirque Harmonique imagined, imagined, believed they communicated with. We can get into all the weeds on whether or not they really believed that the spirits communicated with them. The amount of records they keep, I think, suggests that they believed pretty strongly. You don't keep something up for 20 years if you don't believe in it. But what they imagined, what they saw, what they communicated with was a spiritual utopia that didn't have race or even political borders. The idea of liberté, égalité, fraternité didn't see national borders. According to another spirit, a person's background didn't determine whether or not they would be a good soldier of humanity. In their message, they say, be a person of French, an Austrian, or a Russian. It doesn't matter. Decisions and actions do. On another occasion, a spirit who simply identified themselves as the unknown taught that once Americans extracted all prejudice from their hearts, they would realize they were citizens of the world and not American citizens. They should consider all children of the globe to be their brothers. Even the spirit of General Robert E. Lee, the general, the leader of the Confederate Army, instructed them to unite for the harmony of the races, for the nationalities of this country. And so he's singing a different tune than he did when he was leading the Confederate Army. Now, in death, in interacting with all of the other spirits, he's like, you know, what matters is harmony, not warfare. And though he was the country's first president, the spirit of George Washington chose not to highlight national pride. Um, Rather, in one of his messages, he says he's not French, not Prussian, not African, not Italian, but men, brothers. I am not American. I am of humanity. Its flag is mine. So the couple of images here, the image on the left is the infantry records of the spirit who's behind the message on the right, Jack Thompson, who served in the Union Army in a black regiment coming from Louisiana. Um, and one of the things that I think is really interesting about this very brief message, when Jack Thompson shouldered the musket, it was to battle for human rights. He is all right now, for he has secured a happy home. You know, in the wake of the Civil War, he doesn't emphasize that he fought for the Union. He emphasizes that he battled for human rights, something that is bigger, something that connects people together, something that says equality for all people. And speaking of Black infantrymen in the Civil War, perhaps one of the 1860s biggest celebrities in New Orleans was Captain Andre Caillou. He was an officer in Company E of the Louisiana Native Guards. This was the first Black regiment of the Union Army to see major battle. There was a lot of concern, even from those in the Union, wondering if Black men had it in them to be good, diligent soldiers. In many ways, the bravery of Captain Caillou put a lot of those skeptics' doubts to rest. Um, he died in battle on May 27th, 1863, and his death was mourned by many. His funeral, nearly 2 months later, in July of 1863, was well attended. The top image there is from the national magazine, Harper's, depicting just the huge crowd that came out for his funeral. And he was eulogized strongly during the siege at Port Hudson that summer. He led this courageous charge on the battlefield. Even after one of his arms was shot off by a cannonball, he continued to lead this charge against the Confederate troops. And so his memory was eulogized far beyond just his local funeral. Northern newspapers printed poems celebrating his bravery and his courage. So even in death, his presence could be felt, and even more than felt, it could be heard. Within a couple of weeks of his death, even before his funeral, his spirit came to the Cirque Harmonique. He identified himself as a brave soldier of progress. And though the Confederate Army destroyed his body, his soul lived on. He had fought for freedom in your world, telling them, but he achieved freedom in the invisible world. Truly, God has rewarded me. On another day, later in the 1860s, he gives this very short message to the Cirque Harmonique. His spirit comes, and what's recorded in their records is this brief message from him: man falls, principle lives. So we could say, what's that principle? What is he talking about? I mean, that's a pretty vague message. Man falls, principle lives. But his message came on the heels of a brief message from the spirit of George Washington, celebrating the conclusion of the Confederate Rebellion, and one from radical abolitionist John Brown praising the end of slavery in the US. And right after Captain Caillou's message, the spirit of Andrew Jackson came to say that the cause of the Union was just. And so when he delivers this short message, man falls, principle lives, he's pointing to the significance, the importance of continuing to advocate for the equal rights of all. And this indeed proved to be a really powerful message. In the summer of 1866, there's what's known as the Mechanics' Institute riot. And this begins to put a little bit of a focus on some of the local white supremacist violence in the region and how the spirits instructed the Cirque Harmonique. Black Americans in the South advocated for political equality in the wake of the Civil War. With the passing of those Reconstruction amendments, many states in the South had to rewrite their state constitution because many of their state constitutions had slavery embedded in them. Now they have to rewrite them and include things like voting rights for Black men. So this requires people to get together to rewrite the Constitution. And in the summer of 1866, a group of Black political activists get together to do this. And it begins as this really joyous day. People are excited. They're going to bring Louisiana into this world in which, yes, slavery is abolished. We're working towards equality. And so they march in this big parade to the Mechanics Institute where they're going to have this event. They're going to rewrite the Constitution. They're going to amend it so it reflects, everything in the wake of the Civil War. But a white mob gathers and shoots at them on their way to the event. They get in the building a little shaken. They begin to do their work, but this white mob begins to surround the building. Local policemen and firemen help them get into the building. They come into the building heavily armed and begin to kill the delegates inside, many of whom are unarmed. They didn't bring weapons to amend the Constitution. Their weapon was their pen. At the end of the day, approximately 45 people die, 200 are wounded. But the really interesting thing here is almost immediately appearing in the Cirque Harmonique's records are messages from some of the dead. And they're incredibly vocal about it. One man who had died that day, Victor Lacroix, told them the 30th has been satisfied by our blood as the day of independence for the Black men of Louisiana. That they died for a good cause. That, here's another one, nothing can obscure the road to progress. That they don't necessarily lament their deaths. They lament the violence. They lament the obstacle getting in the way of progress happening, but they're proud to have died for what they died for. This is really well reflected in a message, a spirit message from a local dentist and white ally to Black rights, A.P. Dostie. In October of 1869, he appears in the Cirque Harmonique's records to tell them this: men are not to be killed as dogs. The hour is fast coming when each and every one of you has to account for your doings. Murderers, I am alive and I am awaiting your arrival in the land of justice and equality. God is to be your judge, but Dostie will be the one who will ask him for forgiveness of your great sin. Talk about taking the high road. I mean, this is a guy who is murdered by white supremacists, but his spirit comes to say, you know what, I forgive them because equality has to include all of us. Unfortunately for the Cirque Harmonique and the city of New Orleans itself, as some of you who know your local history well will know that that massacre in 1866 was hardly the only day of racist violence in the city. In September of 1874, members of a white supremacist terrorist organization, the White League, became heavily armed, overpowered the local police, and literally took control of the city. Um, they established a new state government made up of neo-Confederate politicians. They even cut telegraph wires in order to isolate the city that they had taken control of. It would take a number of days for enough federal troops to come into the city to regain control. In the meantime, a number of racist insurgents passed away in the violence. Some of the policemen, at this point, an integrated force, were killed. Bystanders were too. Perhaps the most tragic is a carpenter who was crossing the street trying to get out of the chaos, who was then murdered with his own carpentry tools. Um, Members of the Cirque Harmonique remained publicly quiet during this. Many did. This would have been terrifying. One of the main members of the group, Henri Ray, his brother was a member of the police. And this was 1874. You can't text your brother and see how he's doing in a crisis. This would have been really scary. But they had the spirits buoy them up. The day after the Battle of Liberty Place, the spirit of Saint Vincent de Paul came and comforted them, telling them not to worry about the political unrest taking place right now, that they should stand firm in their views and continue to dedicate themselves to rights for everybody. In other words, no matter what's happening around you, stay focused on the end goal. One thing that becomes even more interesting is the spirit of a Confederate officer, a second lieutenant in the Confederate infantry, also appears to the Cirque Harmonique the day after this infamous battle. Um, and his message is full of emotion. He arrives to the medium. The handwriting doesn't change too much, but I can imagine that the medium must have been feeling all of the emotional chaos of this. The spirit comes and says that he was initially crying and moaning when he entered the spirit world because he had ignored the great and noble thoughts of freedom and equality for all. And instead, he wanted to protect, as he put it, the ideas of the proud oligarchy of race. Then he's followed by St. Vincent de Paul yet again. St. Vincent de Paul's spirit appeared all the time to them. That's a whole nother rabbit hole we could go down. And he gives them this long message of encouraging them to keep faith. So this is sort of abridged here on the screen. The sun of liberty shined brightly on the group with the promise of redemption. Even if they felt despondent, they should not feel they're hated outcasts or pariahs on this arid land. Though this carnage came for them on the 14th of September, 1874, Black civil rights were proclaimed and maintained. He then referenced the massacre of July 30, 1866. So he specifically connects these two events as steps in their redemption, connected to the affirmation of civil rights. And then he tells them the spirit guides are with you. We know your pain, your expectations, and we talk and proclaim your arrival with dignity, recognizing your civil rights. Um, so again, we've got these beloved spiritual celebrities coming in and telling them, don't lose heart, don't lose heart. Yes, this is hard, but don't lose heart. But not that long, just 3 years after the Battle of Liberty Place, the Cirque Harmonique ends their seance practice in 1877. And I think it's no small coincidence that their seance records end in 1877 as the Reconstruction process in the South comes to a close. The federal government pulls out of southern states, trying to ensure that, the Reconstruction amendments that say slavery is abolished, Black people are citizens, Black suffrage for men is a real legal thing. The federal government pulls out of the South, and pretty quickly, old power takes hold. And so, ending their seance practice and their records in 1877, it seems likely that these guys, they lost faith in the possibility of racial harmony in their world. The spirits had promised so much, but didn't deliver. In fact, for most of the final 2 years of their seance records, 1876 and 1877, that group leader, Henri, practiced by himself. Others in his group had maybe left the city. One guy had moved to Chicago. Others just left the seance practice. It was a big time investment to be a part of this group. On some evenings, their seances lasted long enough that they would fill 20 handwritten pages of messages from the spirits. Think about how long it takes you to handwrite 20 pages. These were seances that lasted for a long time. It was something that fulfilled them, but it was a time commitment. And some of them lost faith and hope. And though Henri was alone, the spirit stayed with him. What's up there on the screen is actually the very last message that he recorded on November 24th, 1877. The spirit of an anonymous friend encourages him, today how your heart is full of hope, confidence, and assurance of ultimate success. Remember, we are with you always. And even though Henri likely felt disheartened as he recorded this final message, the power of the messages could not be denied. In fact, when his home burned down a few years after the end of the group, the records were one of the belongings that he saved. And I'm glad they survived. They would be cared for later on by one of the son-in-laws of one of the mediums, a Creole man by the name of René Grandjean, who would later donate all of these records to the library at the University of New Orleans, where I've had I would say, special privilege to spend days and days flipping through these. And I sometimes think about how they almost went up in flames. And I think about Henri as he likely was gauging, what do I save from my burning house? He saves these. But I don't want to end us on a dour note. So here's one final message from the spirits to round out the evening before I try to answer some of your questions. So on George Washington's birthday in 1869, his birthday is February 22nd, Thomas Jefferson appeared for his only message in their records. He said that Washington's birthday was a day to be celebrated. It marked the birth of a man who had a God-given mission to create a new nation and a new government and a new people shaped by new political ideas. So it was a happy, hopeful time. However, Jefferson's spirit said, we haven't fulfilled that destiny because there's been a dark stain on our history. The incomprehensible abuse, as he puts it, of the slaveholding class. He wrote that members of this aristocracy, how he referred to enslavers, did not realize the harm that they caused Black people. which I have to admit, I kind of roll my eyes a little bit when I read that, considering that Thomas Jefferson was an enslaver himself. Um, I think he probably did realize the harm, but maybe his spirit is working some stuff out. So he says members of the aristocracy did not realize the harm that they caused them. However, he says with the defeat of the Confederacy, a shining new era for this young republic had begun. The tree of domination and injustice was defeated, and the darkness that had invaded this young republic was disappearing before the bright light brought by justice. Finally, the last sighs of the oligarchy of the South were over, and now the US could be the world's greatest republic. The country's new citizens, he said, referring to those who had been recently freed from slavery, would defend this nation with more courage than anyone else and ensure that the US fulfilled their promise to shelter the oppressed and the disinherited of the earth. So the spirits of New Orleans always had hope that the United States could be better than it was. They always had hope that the US would live up to its promises of freedom and equality for all. And while the Cirque Harmonique stopped practicing spiritualism there in 1877, I think so many of the messages that they received still have so much to teach us about liberty and justice for all. And then I know my publisher would want me to do this. If you're curious for more, um, there is a whole book that you can read about this. So I hope people enjoyed that. And Amy, I will give it back over to you for questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. Prescient words feel as relevant at this moment as they did so many decades ago. Um, I have some questions from guests already. Folks, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A little chat box. It's not the chat, but it's called Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And that will allow me to easily field the questions. I also have some of my own if people are slow in thinking of more. And we will go until no later than 9 p.m. Central Time. Okay, so the first question I have here is what happened to the Fox sisters after they went into the city? Did they become leaders in the spiritualism movement in New York?
Yes. Also, my dog just woke up from a nap. I heard her shake, so hopefully we won't be visited by an 85-pound dog. She is loud. Um, the Fox sisters totally became leaders in the earliest years of the spiritualist movement. In some ways, reluctant leaders. Kate and Maggie, who were identified as being the most skilled between the three, were 8 and 12 when this first started happening. Um, they would do public demonstrations facilitating the knocks from the spirits. Oh, I should be careful. My dog will think someone's knocking at the door. Um, they would facilitate these large public demonstrations, but it wasn't easy for them. I mean, I feel like every day almost there's news of a child star from Hollywood who has later struggled with all sorts of mental health challenges. The same was true for them. Both Maggie and Kate became alcoholics later in life. Probably because, I mean, think about how messed up their childhood was. But they were still very much leaders in the movement. They did these big public demonstrations, but in many ways, it was other members of the spiritualist movement that really blew it up to a national level, who really took what the Fox sisters did, the interpretation of those knocks and raps, They also sometimes, things levitated during their seances. Others took it to a whole new level. In fact, in the 1880s, Maggie, the middle daughter, published a confession that they had made it all up, that they were actually double jointed and they were young and their bodies were still developing. So they would pop joints to create the knocks and wraps. Then 2 months later, she published a confession about that confession, saying that she was paid for that confession. And actually, it was all true. So they become these reluctant celebrities, but then many others take over. And in many ways, whenever I think about them, read read about stories from the 19th century from their lives, I often just feel a lot of sympathy for them. Because just imagine being 12 and that being your life.
Yeah. Yeah, that's wild. Um, Another guest asked, which member of the Cercle Harmonique moved to Chicago?
Ooh, I gotta admit, I cannot remember off the top of my head who that was. I do remember that it was a guy whose father gave one of my favorite messages from the spirits, because it tells us a lot about what might have been happening at that seance. Um, oh, I could flip through my own copy of my book to remind myself who it was, but his father gave this message at one evening that basically said, "Hey, boys, keep your minds focused on what matters and keep them out of the gutter." Um, that he kind of insinuates that some of them might have been thinking about romantic issues than necessarily what they should be focusing in on. And it just always cracks me up when I think about that message because it's like dad still has comments for you. Um, which is related to one of my other favorite messages that comes from another medium's mother, that she begins the message that's written down from her begins with like, I thought we had established that punctuality was very important. And it cracks me up because it's like mom shames still come from the other side. So I can't think of the name of the guy who went to Chicago, but I remember the spirit of his dad really, really well. Because I think, I focus so much on the really politically charged messages, but sometimes it's the messages from their deceased loved ones that are almost the most fascinating because they're almost so mundane. Like, I thought we had established punctuality was important. Clearly, someone showed up late that night. Uh, and yeah, the messages, they're just so human.
Yeah, that's amazing. I actually had a question kind of related to that, is if you noticed any trends in the kinds of messages associated with certain types of figures.
Yeah. Um, so the spirits who identified as being involved with the Confederacy would frequently have an element of contrition in their messages, an element of apology. Um, in fact, there's like one message from one spirit that was just identified as a Confederate soldier, um, that identifies that he now realizes that what he fought for was wrong. There's one message that the sign off is just Booth, possibly John Wilkes Booth, um, that it's very short and it's just regret. So I think that's a clear theme, that those who would easily be identifiable as obstacles for equal rights, they appear with messages of contrition. Um, Messages from religious figures, especially Saint Vincent de Paul, often emphasize taking care of those who are less fortunate, as St. Vincent de Paul did in real life, but also frequently connect into issues spiritual, issues religious, which makes sense because he was a religious figure. Um, Another really powerful theme. I mean, everything from the spirit of Abraham Lincoln and John Brown are always about politics, always specifically about that. Neither of their spirits ever say anything like, I thought we had established punctuality was important. They have a very clear focus. Um, and there's one other one. Sometimes when it's a well-known local, they will always connect to local issues. Um, Occasionally, the group would open up and invite people outside the group to seances. And they would often note, so and so was here as a guest, and it was usually friends of theirs from politics. And usually on those evenings, the messages would all be political. They wouldn't really get into um, kind of the social everyday life. They would be very focused on, what the people there had in common.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I have two sort of similar questions. I'll put them together. One person asks, do you see a connection between the Cercle Harmonique and the later Black spiritual church movement? And then another person asks if you know of any other historic or contemporary Black spiritualist groups in the United States.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Black spiritualist church movement, which really gets going in the 1920s, certainly has a connection to seance spiritualism. Um, there are practices of communicating with spirits of the dead, especially um, Native American spirits are very popular in the Black spiritualist churches, but they go beyond seance spiritualism. They combine that with elements of Pentecostalism and Catholicism and create something completely new. Um, I don't believe any members of the Cirque Harmonique end up in that trajectory. But I think if we think about it on like a bigger level of like this religion influences this religion, I think there's clear influence in part because some members of the Cirque Harmonique were well known. Henri was a local politician. J.B. Valmore was a well-known and respected blacksmith and spiritualist healer. So I think awareness of their seance practice was known, um, and had to have played a role in the creation of the Black spiritualist churches. Um, I know you combined two questions. Did that get it?
The other one was if there were any other historic or contemporary Black spiritualist groups in the United States.
Um, there are, in terms of seance spiritualism, it's less popular today than it was, in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. We have Harry Houdini actually to thank for a lot of that. He was a huge debunker of spiritualism, despite the fact that he stole a lot of his stage ideas from mediums. Um, for the most part, a lot of contemporary seance spiritualist groups, they're primarily small. Um, they're primarily interracial. In terms of one that's really active, that is kind of in the same vein of like Black rights. I don't know if there is one. There might be. But being someone who so often lives in the 19th century, I'm not sure.
For sure. And I was also curious. I know in many places throughout the Americas, um, spiritualism really linked up with Afro-diasporic religion, and in some cases, birthed new religions. And that's almost more talked about than a connection between spiritualism and Christianity in places like Brazil and Cuba. I'm curious if you see here in New Orleans a connection between spiritualism and voodoo.
So I love this question because it is not what I was expecting when it comes to this group. Um, They have in some of their messages comments that are antagonistic towards voodoo. Um, they specifically in one message like equate it to the superstitions of Catholicism. Because despite the fact that Henri was raised Catholic, he moved away from it. He saw it as, priests and whatnot were superstitious. Communicating with spirits of the dead was rational. And so I one of the things that in all the time that I spent with their seance records, I was just like, what? This is not what I thought. I figured there would be a lot more clear connections with voodoo. And I've researched, like 19th century voodoo too. So I knew what to look for. And I think one reason why this is in part a little bit of speculation, but I think one reason why they distance themselves from voodoo um, is they really want to have a clear focus on this is about political empowerment right now. We're not talking to, the spirits of the Haitian voodoo Loa. They're not going to be helpful for us. Abraham Lincoln will be. So I think it has something to do with their focus, and they really want to emphasize the rational practicality of what they do. And so they kind of, in those couple of messages, kind of throw voodoo under the bus as something superstitious and something very different from what they're doing. But it was not what I was anticipating at all. Um,
Yeah,
it was really interesting.
that's fascinating. I'm curious if that might have something to do with like the way that voodoo is at least talked about and thought of to be localized to New Orleans, though that's not 100% the case, or at least to Louisiana and like very specific parts of the South. Whereas maybe in other places, like in Brazil, it's not a regional thing, right? It's anywhere in the country. And so there's not the same kind of extra factor of folks in New Orleans kind of thinking about where they sit in this country that already thinks that they're, you know, superstitious Catholics, never mind
Yeah.
practicing voodoo.
Yeah, I think that plays a big role in it. I think that's totally right. And then I could never figure out like a very clear answer on things. But as I tried to dig through some of the genealogy of some of the members, there were at least rumors that one of the mediums, his dad, had an affair with Marie Laveau. Now, whether that's true, who knows? To me, that's like not even the point whether it's true or not. Like the fact that there were rumors about it and he would have been aware of this, the desire then to like distance, um, is really like that's the part that's really interesting. He's like, but that's not what we're doing. That's not what we're doing. We're doing something very, very different. Um, but like that's all rumor, which is always fun and interesting, but hard to know for sure if it's true.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a lot of questions. I'm just sort of sorting through them to pick out some juicy ones. Um, did the records made by the Cercle Harmonique tell what process they used to connect? Did they enter the seances with specific topics that they wanted information about?
That's a great question. And one of the things I love as a historian who researched them, they had this one like loose sheet of paper in one of their records that was like instructions for seances, where it's like, excellent, this is exactly what I was hoping I would find. Um, what that really focuses in on is punctuality, as that one member's mom really rammed home. What it really emphasizes is that, in order to establish harmony amongst them, this was a very common spiritualist thing. We have to create harmony amongst the group, in order to enable communication to happen. If we're all at sixes and sevens with each other, the spirits are not going to be able to come. But if we get on the same page with one another, they can. Um, and in their instructions, they really highlight, pick a few previous messages to read together and focus in on.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't give instruction as to how you should pick them or why you should pick them. So I think we can imagine that they would have picked things based on what was going on that day. Um, and whatever it was in those messages that they wanted to revisit and talk about in order to establish harmony of a group likely played a role in whatever messages they received. Um, and so their instructions focused on how do we get in harmony with each other. And it was reading previous messages, which I think is why Henri, I think I saw a question or a comment on like, he saved those records. Like those records were his friends in some ways. Like they use these as a tool all the time, um, to focus and center themselves.
Wow, that's fascinating. Um, Another question here. How did African Americans from the North view seances and cercle harmonique?
So in all honesty, African Americans in the North probably had no idea that the Soror Harmonique existed. Um, in general, in general, seance spiritualism was much more popular amongst white Americans. There were, and these are always really interesting cases of African American, usually women, who were intrigued by spiritualism and engaged with it. In fact, Sojourner Truth lived with a spiritualist community for a few years, in aptly named Harmonia, Michigan. They, because they were such a statistical small group, it's hard to say exactly what their views on the Cirque Harmonique would have been. Those Black spiritualists in the North. And then I think in general, I mean, this is something that gets highlighted in research about voodoo in Haiti today. I love this statistic that one of the foremost scholars of Haitian voodoo, Claudine Michel, has said, which is of the Haitian population, um, 85% are Catholic, 15% are Protestant, and 95% are voodooists, identifying a big overlap between Catholicism and Voodooism, but not Protestantism. And when we think about the US and Black Christianity in the US, it's overwhelmingly Protestant. And so I think one reason why they were just not that interested in seance spiritualism in the North was they had, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. They had these other very politically engaged Black Protestant churches. Um, I don't want to say they didn't need seance spiritualism, but it wasn't necessarily on their radar. It was something that, in particular, white women embraced.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And there might not have been a space demanding it to the same degree. Um, Another person asks, is there a singular event connected to the decline of participation in the Cercle Harmonique and the registers? Um, they understand that it got to a point where it was just Ray. And they mentioned they're a descendant of Emile Blanchard and doing research on his life. He was a police officer at the time of Liberty Place, but was began passing later in the century. I'm not sure exactly what they're referring to. He might be able to fill in the gaps.
So that last name pops up a lot in their records. So your family is in their records. So that's cool. Um, In terms of a singular event, I think it's hard to point to a singular event. I think it just is that layering of just opportunity after opportunity for real progress to happen, and it doesn't seem to happen. So I think rather than a real event, it was just, or a singular event, I think it was, I don't want to say like the death by a thousand cuts, um, but I think it was more subtle than something in particular that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. I think it was just, I don't want to say impatience, but loss of faith. Um, I can imagine some would continue showing up for the weekly seances and just kind of slowly realize their heart's not in it anymore. That this is not how they want to spend 3 hours of their evening. They've got all these other things going on. Um, so I think rather than a singular event, it was just kind of slow resignation, which I realize is like incredibly depressing.
Very real.
Yeah, I tell my students all the time, sometimes I just teach you things that are very depressing.
Yeah.
But at least I
Uh,
do it smiley and bubbly. Doesn't that help?
yeah, at least it's a little spooky. Um, someone asked if you could put the picture of the book back up.
Sure.
And there's also just some questions about um, where you're from, why you got interested in this period in New Orleans, and specifically doing this research about Cercle Monique.
Sure. Let me get picture back up. Um, so I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. Um, I have never lived in New Orleans. My husband did. It's actually one of our bonding moments early in our relationship was we nerded out over New Orleans things. I grew up in San Antonio, and in graduate school, I got really curious and interested about just this intersection of religion and politics and, for lack of a better term, social justice. These things just fascinated me. And I did a project early in grad school on the religious art of Sister Gertrude Morgan, a New Orleans artist. And it was kind of an offhand suggestion by an art history professor of mine of like, I think you'll find this person really interesting. And I did. And then I just didn't leave researching the city for a while. And on a personal level, New Orleans and San Antonio are very, very different, but they also have a lot in common when it comes to this close relationship between religion and not necessarily, formalized official religion, but just sort of what people do, like second line traditions, are to me reminiscent of processions with saint statues in Mexican American Catholicism. Like there's a lot of interesting similarities that I think in some ways found New Orleans really familiar um, in that way. Again, not that it's by any means the same as San Antonio, but there was something about it that it caught me. And where I did my PhD at Florida State University, it's in Tallahassee. It's only a 5 hour drive. So it was really easy to get there to do research. So it was kind of I don't know, a little bit of serendipity. Maybe the spirit of Henri was, manipulating forces for that to happen. But I'm so glad that whatever it was, it did happen. And then the first day that I was there doing archival research at the University of New Orleans, I gave the archivist this huge list of things that I wanted to look at. I want to look at this document and this 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 and this. And she looked at it and she goes, "Well, where would you like to start?" And I was like, "I don't know. I want all of these things." And she looked at it and she looked at me and she said, "You're a PhD student in religion. I'm going to get you the seance records. I'm going to have you start with those. They're really interesting." And I was like, "Excellent." Oh my goodness, am I glad she did that. Her name's Dr. Florence Humanville. She was the special collection archivist, librarian at University of New Orleans. And I gave her a big shout out in the book acknowledgments because I don't think I would have ended up really focusing in on this unless she had suggested it. It was a nice little nudge from a librarian. Go librarians.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Archivists are the angels of our profession, for
Absolutely.
sure. Well, we are at 9 o'clock. So I will give my official outro on behalf of the Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. I would like to thank Dr. Clark for speaking with us this evening. Everyone, we did record this and it's going to be on YouTube tomorrow. So if you want to watch it again, you can, or if you want to tell your friends to watch it, you can do that as well. For more information on future Gallier gatherings, including next month's book discussion night on November 12th, where we will be reading Creole Italian, Sicilian Immigrants, and the Shaping of New Orleans Food Culture. Please visit our website at hgghh.org. Registration is up on Eventbrite, and the first 20 people to register will receive a free copy of the book. And I would like to once again thank our fantastic speaker and thank you, our audience, for your continued support of our museum. And we look forward to seeing you at our next Gallier gathering. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you, Amy. This was great.
Yeah. All right. Take care.